Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, and specifically these books, Game of Thrones and Philosophy. There are two volumes. The one is called Game of Thrones and Philosophy, Logic Cuts Deeper Than Swords, is the first volume, and the second volume is called The Ultimate Game of Thrones and Philosophy, You Think or You Die. I thought it was very interesting to read these books because I have been a fan of the TV series Game of Thrones for some time. I've watched all episodes, all seasons. I especially love the first 4 seasons. The 5th I thought was not so good. The 6th was somewhat better, I thought. But I also read the first 2 books in the series, which is the first one, of course, is called Game of Thrones. The second is called A Clash of Kings, but I didn't like them very much. I got stuck actually at the beginning of the 3rd volume, and I was surprised because I started watching the TV series and then I read the first 2 volumes in the series by George R.R. Martin, and I was fairly disappointed, I must say, because I loved the TV series, the first 4 seasons. I thought there was no real intensity. The books weren't exciting, they were fairly boring. The characters had no real depth, which I think they have in the TV series. I think they vastly improved on the characters in the TV series. They made it much more exciting, much faster. There has been really good acting in the TV series over the seasons, and there still is, although I think in the last 2 seasons the story was not that exciting anymore. But another problem with the books, at least the first volume of Martin's books, is that he's constantly switching the perspective of the narration from an authoritarian perspective, which means that the storyteller knows everything and tells the story to the reader as if he were a god. He knows everything, he can tell what everyone feels and thinks and so on. And the other perspective is a personal perspective where the narration comes from one of the character who is the point of view character. And in the first volume you can see and again that Martin switches between these 2 perspectives, which is fairly annoying. I think it gets better in the second volume, but still it's fairly tiring. And now to these books, Game of Thrones and Philosophy. I enjoyed the first volume very much, which came out in 2012, I believe. Yep. And then I read the second volume, which came out this year in 2017, The Ultimate Game of Thrones and Philosophy, and I thought this one was fairly unnecessary because it took up the same topics again, basically, and didn't add very much to the philosophical discussions. And the philosophical discussions were not really philosophical in most cases. They were more about the characters, actually, than about philosophy. So what I will do now is I will talk about this first volume, several of the topics contained in this first volume, because they are very interesting, and it makes, I think, the TV series and hopefully also the books more interesting if you know a bit about these philosophical topics and their history. It goes back to Aristotle and Plato. You can also discuss existentialism, Sartre, for example. You can discuss Thomas Hobbes. You can discuss Machiavelli and several others. And it brings another depth to the story in A Game of Thrones, which is the TV series, or A Song of Ice and Fire, which are the books. So I hope this will be interesting. I don't think I will read volume 3, 4 and 5 or 6, etc. Of the books, but I will watch the last 2 seasons of the TV series. They are said to be 8 seasons in all, and I'm looking forward to that. And it was interesting to read at least this book about the philosophy of Game of Thrones, because I think philosophy is done best in a narrative context. If you have a narration about people who feel like real people, like they do in the TV series, not in the books, according to my opinion, but in the TV series they do, and you have them confronted with philosophical topics in ethics, metaphysics, and so on. The philosophical problems come alive in a way that they don't usually do in academic literature. So I hope this will be an interesting discussion, and I look forward to your comments. A Song of Ice and Fire is a story about the struggle for power. Game of Thrones and Philosophy compares the world of Westeros to that of Thomas Hobbes, who lived in the 17th century, which was a very turbulent and dangerous time in English history. For Hobbes, the state of nature is not one of peaceful cooperation, but of constant war, in which no development is possible. Peace requires us to submit our loyalty to an all-powerful ruler who will enforce laws, thus securing the stability necessary for the well-being of the citizens. This is basically the philosophy behind the political system found in Westeros. The Iron Throne, made of melted swords from the Seven Kingdoms, symbolizes both supreme authority and the fragility of the system. A further philosophy mirroring that of the world of Westeros can be found in Niccolò Machiavelli from the late 15th and early 16th century. For both Hobbes and Machiavelli, power is to be sought for the sake of the state, and the security of the state is the highest goal. This is the philosophy of Varys, one of the members of the King's Council. Virtue ethics, developed by Plato and further by Aristotle, and flourishing again in our time, is concerned with character rather than with rules or actions. An example of a virtuous person in the books is Eddard Stark, who is courageous, just, honest, and loyal. But whereas virtue is associated with moral qualities, Machiavelli's concept of virtue or virtu simply means the skills needed for taking and holding power. For Machiavelli, actions are good or bad to the extent that they increase or decrease a person's power. Arya Stark is faceless even before she meets the faceless men, the assassins who are able to change their appearance at will. She is able to disguise herself as a girl or a boy, and she is able to act whatever part she chooses to play. This is in accordance with Machiavelli's teachings. In The Prince, he says that a person with virtu is someone who is so flexible that even carefully constructed appearances can be changed at a moment's notice. The Machiavellian displays virtue in the classical sense only when necessary. Terrorizing one's subjects, for example, is a bad idea, since it will provoke rebellion. And classical virtue can even be a hindrance, as seen in the case of Lord Stark, whose honesty makes him blind to other people's deceit. Lord Stark is virtuous, but he does not possess virtu, which makes him vulnerable. He is an idealist, adhering to his own ideas of honesty and of justice, refusing to adjust to the situation even when the security of the state and its citizens is threatened, which leads to his own downfall and to civil war and the death of thousands. Thus, A Song of Ice and Fire is also a story about the failure of idealism in the world, reminiscent of Dostoevsky's The Idiot. There is a rather uninspired and vague discussion of the problem of just war in the book, referring to the war between King Joffrey Baratheon and Robb Stark, the king in the north. Apparently, just war theory discusses the rules of a just war, which form or should form a kind of code of honor for political leaders. The theory claims that a war is considered just if fought for a just reason, such as self-defense, defending a weaker nation against a stronger aggressor, or innocence against a tyrannical regime, or to prevent the violation of basic human rights. Further, a state is justified in going to war only if the decision is made by a legitimate authority. All reasonable possibilities for a resolution of the conflict must be taken into consideration before going to war, and the citizens of both countries must be notified of the intention of war. However, we are not told who these just war theorists are, and if they are arguing from a religious perspective. I know that the Catholic Church has a just war theory, but the Church is not mentioned in the essay. And what is a legitimate authority? If the ruler is tyrannical, then he is not justified in going to war, we are told. This is a strange argument, because being tyrannical does not exclude ruling legitimately. And we are not told what these reasonable possibilities for a resolution of the conflict are. The author acknowledges the fact that both enemies may consider themselves fighting a just war, but for different reasons, like Joffrey and Robb. Far more interesting is the discussion of just killing. Is there a moral difference between killing and letting die, between active and passive euthanasia? What if Daenerys had left Drogo to die instead of strangling him? Was he still a person after having lost his mind? Such a handicap as that of Drogo places an enormous burden on those charged with his care, especially, of course, out in the desert. But are not all handicapped people, and all children, a burden to the one taking care of them? Drogo's situation can be compared to a case of severe brain injury. But what of Bran after his accident, when it was still unsure whether he would ever wake up from his coma? What if Catelyn had killed him? Bran did wake up and regained his cognitive abilities. Drogo wouldn't have. Is personhood the distinguishing factor? But is an infant a person or a fetus? If self-consciousness is a criterion for personhood, they are not persons. For philosopher Peter Singer, a significantly disabled infant is not a person, and killing it fails to count as murder. And in many cases, he says, it wouldn't be wrong. Is this more or less controversial than the killing of Drogo by Daenerys? Some traditions in Westeros may seem morally wrong to us, like that of the Dothraki murdering and raping after a battle, or the incestuous relationship between Cersei and Jaime. Claiming the existence of universal moral truths means adhering to moral universalism, as opposed to moral relativism. Are moral judgments justifiable beyond the beliefs of an individual or a culture? Cultural relativism says that different cultures have different moral codes. For the Dothraki, rape and murder are no taboos. But moral relativism goes further than this. It claims that moral codes are not right or wrong, merely different. There are no universal standards of right and wrong. And since moral practices differ around the world, we should not assume that our own moral practices are based on a universal rational standard. But although we need to keep an open mind about other cultures' practices, this doesn't mean that we have to adopt them or that we have to accept everything, the author says. To her, some actions like rape are simply wrong. However, she fails to explain if she means that this is an objective truth, or if this is her subjective opinion because the victim is made to suffer horribly. Why did the gods create the world if there is so much evil in it? Surely we can imagine a world that is better than that of Westeros. According to one of the religions, there are two gods, Rolor, the Lord of Light, and his enemy, the Great Other, the God of Darkness. This resembles Zoroastrianism, in which a good and an evil god are at eternal war, and in which humans have to choose the side. It can explain natural evils as caused by the evil god, like cold winters and the others. But they seem to be equal in power, which means that neither of them is omnipotent. And the followers of the good god are not innocent. Melisandre, for example, has caused many deaths. If she is doing her god's bidding, it is questionable whether the Lord of Light is a good god. And the sheer amount of evil in Westeros may make one suspect that there is no gods at all, at least not gods who are good and powerful. The book further contains a critical essay on chivalry. According to the author, chivalry fails as an ethical code because it devalues women. Protecting women prevents them from leading full lives instead of empowering them to protect themselves. Chivalry creates rigid social roles in which adult women are treated as children and encouraged to be vulnerable and dependent, for which reason chivalry is unjust. Except for dictating gender roles, it also dictates heterosexuality. However, she doesn't take into regard that Westeros is a medieval society, where in fact most women are in perpetually vulnerable state, and so there is need for chivalry. Chivalry would be unjust in our modern Western society, but not in Westeros, and possibly not in the Third World. Further, a medieval society is built on gender roles, regardless of chivalry. Even today, we need a certain amount of gender roles, since they are part of our identities as men and women. And heterosexuality has always been the norm and should continue to be the norm if mankind is to survive. This is true of a medieval society like Westeros as well as of our own world. There is also an interesting essay about fate and fatalism. Fatalism is the idea that the future is set and cannot be changed, like the motto of the House of Stark, "Winter is coming." Daenerys thinks that it is her fate to sit on the Iron Throne, and that this must come true. But how does this relate to human freedom? Many philosophers claim that there can be no freedom if fatalism is true. Either freedom or fatalism is an illusion. For Aristotle, statements about the future are neither true nor false, and thus there is no fate. In this way, he avoids the conclusion that we have no control over our lives and that there is no individual responsibility. For Sartre, human existence precedes essence, which means that humans are utterly free. The essence of a hammer is to drive nails well into wood, for example, and likewise animals may have an essence, i.e. their fundamental characteristics. Man, however, is absolutely free to choose the kind of person he wants to be, so in a way there is no human essence. In spite of categories like class, status, and tradition, which are all of great importance in Westeros, A person can reflect on his actions and choose to do something else than originally intended. We become radically aware of our absolute freedom of choice when we experience anguish or angst, which is the feeling we have when realizing that we are making a decision for our whole life. This is what Lord Stark experiences when considering whether to confess to treason without being guilty, to save the lives of his daughters, or to stick to the truth. Choosing in spite of our anguish is living authentically, instead of denying our freedom of choice by referring to matters outside of our control. This is what Sansa does when she thinks she has no choice but to lie about Joffrey's attack against Mycah. She is acting inauthentically, or as Sartre calls it, in bad faith. But is fatalism and freedom really incompatible? After the death of Khal Drogo, Daenerys is in full control of her actions, in spite of her sense of fatalism, as the future Queen of Westeros. Only when she is certain that fate is in control does she feel truly free. Perhaps Dany's belief in her own fate is mistaken, or perhaps her sense of autonomy is an illusion that she needs to fulfill her destiny. But in fact, many people feel liberated when they think they have discovered a meaning or purpose in their lives that they did not decide themselves, like becoming a Christian. The fact that Daenerys is destined to rule Westeros does not mean that it doesn't matter what she does. If she remains in Meereen, she will not rule Westeros. Of course, what we do does affect the future. Fatalism doesn't matter for deciding what to do, and it is no threat to our agency. The author now distinguishes between autonomy and authenticity. Autonomy means being able to control what one does, free from external or internal compulsion. Authenticity, on the other hand, means freedom as owning oneself, in Heidegger's words, Eigentlichkeit. We are all shaped by our past. We are determined by our character, which is dependent on our history. For Heraclitus, character meant destiny. Tyrion's compassion for the weak and the outcast stems from his life circumstances, being a dwarf. Had he cared for the people if he had not been an outcast himself, say, if he would have had his brother Jaime's body? Circumstance plays a substantial part in molding our characters. Thus, there is no freedom in Sartre's sense, the author concludes. For Heidegger, freedom means fulfilling one's past in choosing to fulfill one's purpose, one purpose, rather than another. In this sense, we are free, since we live authentically as individuals. It is a notion of freedom and of being responsible for what we are, understood not as autonomy, but as authenticity. Fate and justice do not align in the books, giving them a sense of realism, the author says. Good characters die needlessly, while bad characters succeed. A Song of Ice and Fire differs from any other works of fantasy like the Lord of the Rings, the Chronicles of Narnia, and the Harry Potter series, in that moral goodness does not secure a happy life. The view that being good means being happy originated in Plato. For Plato, virtue means being governed by one's reason, which is controlling one's appetites. Such a person cannot be harmed by anything, since the only real harm is to become vicious, which means submitting one's will to one's appetites. An example of such a person would be Cersei Lannister. She constantly wants more than what she has, and so she is never satisfied. Her selfishness makes her unstable, impatient, imprudent, even paranoid, regarding everyone except herself and her children as enemies. She may secure success and pleasure for the moment only, but further success requires further deception, thus she can never be happy.
So far, Plato's theory seems correct. But what about Eddard Stark? Obviously, he's not happy either, at least not after having to leave his castle and his land, although being brave, honest, and loyal. For Aristotle, a good character is necessary for happiness, but it's not enough. Health and some external goods are also needed, as well as friends. Like Aristotle, Martin avoids the stressing of just one of the two. Fantasy still allows for a sense of wonder in our world of advanced physical science, where there is little place for the supernatural. There is a discussion of science and magic in Westeros in the book in relation to metaphysics, i.e., questions concerning the ultimate nature of reality. Magic involves violations of physical laws, and when magic affects the world, it does so by disrupting physical, chemical, or biological processes. But if all causation requires physical causation, which modern science seems to imply, are souls or non-physical minds violations of the laws of physics? The author asks. Are they magical? Perhaps to us, immaterial stuff is just as improbable as magic.